Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm Catherine Sharbaugh, Director of Donor Relations and Special Initiatives at the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School. And it is my pleasure tonight to welcome you all to the Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture. Tonight we have Dr. Babak Elahi presenting An Epitome of Time and Fashion, Clothing and Society in Hawthorne's America. The Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history. Thank you, Alan, for your continued support of bringing these wonderful lectures to the FIA. The next Sheppy Dog Fund lecture will be on Wednesday, March 26th, with Dr. Ashley Lemke presenting Flooded History, Underwater Archaeology in the Great Lakes. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continuing support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. I would like to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which also provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County's citizens 7 days a week. And a big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone beyond our county to have free entry on Saturdays. Now, please take a moment and silence your electronic devices. Dr. Babak Elahi is the Dean of College and Science and Liberal Arts at Kettering University, where he also teaches writing, literature, and leadership. Prior to joining Kettering, Elahi was a professor of communication and literature at the College of Liberal Arts at the Rochester Institute of Technology, where he also served as associate dean from 2011 to 2016. He holds his doctorate in American literature from the University of Rochester. His scholarship spans the areas of American literature and popular culture, Iranian diasporic life, writing, modern Iranian fiction, and documentary film. He also sings the blues and is a guitar player, performing occasionally at local bars in Flint. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Elahi.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the FIA for having me this evening. And for all of you for being here. I'm really excited to be giving this talk on a subject that's near and dear to me. So I'll just get started. The most famous statement about clothing in American literature is Henry David Thoreau's warning about activities that require new clothes. I'm going to adjust the mic a little bit more. So what did he say about activities that require new clothes? He said, "Beware of all enterprises that require new clothes. If there is not a new man, how can there be new clothes? We should never procure a new suit, however ragged or dirty the old, until we have so sailed in some way that we feel like new men in the old, and that to retain it would be like keeping new wine in old bottles. Our molting season, like that of the fowls, must be a crisis in our lives." This image of Thoreau, by the way, is something that a Michigan resident actually asked him to send him. It was a daguerreotype photograph that was specifically someone in Michigan said, "Hey, I really like you. Can you send me a picture?" Nathaniel Hawthorne seems to have taken Thoreau's advice at least twice in his life. First, in 1846, when he was appointed as the Salem Custom House surveyor by the Polk administration, his wife, Sophia Peabody, wrote to her father asking him to order Nathaniel a new suit of clothes from a Boston tailor. Hawthorne had taken the job because his career as a writer was at a standstill. He had published a mediocre novel at the age of 24 in 1828. And it was his opinion that it was mediocre. Several short stories, and briefly edited the Democratic Review and other magazines. He was a writer, but he couldn't make it pay. The custom house job was a concession to his meager purse. Whoops. Then, in 1852, after having written his 3 major novels and achieved critical, if not popular, success, Hawthorne took another civil service job. His old college friend, Franklin Pierce, now the President of the United States, appointed Hawthorne the American consul at Liverpool. This may have been a favor for Hawthorne, having written Pierce's campaign biography. Again, Hawthorne was a new man. He had sailed in such a way, to use Thoreau's words, that his old clothes did not fit his new character. So Hawthorne wrote to his publisher, William Ticknor, complaining that, quote, his best dress coat was rather shabby, befitting an author much more than a man of consular rank. And the image on the left, I've chosen that specifically because it was by Washington Allston, painted much earlier than what I'm quoting here, but Allston happened to give painting lessons to Sophia Peabody. So I thought it was fitting that this image of a poor author and a rich bookseller, which some things never change, I guess. But for Thoreau, the problem wasn't so much the new clothes themselves, but rather the social, economic, and political implications of those new clothes. After his warning about new clothes, Thoreau went on to say the following, quote, I cannot believe that our factory system is the best mode by which men may get clothing. The condition of the operatives is becoming every day more like that of the English. As far as I have heard or observed, the principal object is not that mankind may be well and honestly clad, but unquestionably that the corporations may be enriched, end quote. He insisted, in fact, that it was better to wear clothes made at home at nominal cost, his words again, than to buy the cheap, ready-made clothing that was becoming widely available in the 1840s. But Hawthorne considered Thoreau to be a bit of a crank. Writing to a friend in England, Hawthorne complained that Thoreau is, quote, not an agreeable person, and that in his presence one feels ashamed of having any money or a house to live in or so much as 2 coats to wear. These 2 acquaintances, Thoreau and Hawthorne, were on opposite sides of a cultural divide. Thoreau challenged the dominant values of his time, expressing his countercultural views in many ways, including his opinions about clothing. Hawthorne, on the other hand, as someone who benefited from political favors, had to follow convention. Sometimes he just needed a new suit. I begin with Thoreau's attack on fashion and Hawthorne's conventional wardrobe to point to a broader societal conflict in the first half of the 19th century in the United States. From the Puritans' hierarchical sumptuary laws to the championing of homespun clothing during the American Revolution, on to America's slave economy, in which Southern plantations provided cotton for New England's booming textile industry. Throughout these historical changes in American society, clothing was a political arena. I focus on Hawthorne, whose career spans the 1830s to about 1860, because he is both representative and in some ways unusual for his time. He was not as radical as Thoreau, but he grappled with some key ideas of his era, such as the nostalgia for homespun clothing that he observed, the image of the seamstress as a subject of social reform, or ready-made clothing's transformation of America into a truly commercial society. I'll delve into each of these as we proceed this evening. Hawthorne's fiction offers a window into this important aspect of American material culture. In using clothing so extensively in his work, Hawthorne was engaging in cultural and political debates at the center of American society in the early 1800s. The position he took ultimately was somewhat conventional. It was moderate, if not downright conservative in many ways. But in some ways, especially in his portrayal of strong female characters, he was surprisingly ahead of his time. One way we know that Hawthorne was interested in clothing is to take a close look at his notebooks, his journaling, where he described clothing he either observed directly or saw in paintings and statuary from the Puritan and Revolutionary periods. For example, in a journal entry from 1838, Hawthorne described in some detail this portrait of General William Pepperell that he had seen in the Essex Historical Society. And he described it as follows: Sir William Pepperell, in English regimentals, coat, waistcoat, and breeches, all of red broadcloth, richly gold embroidered. He holds a general's truncheon in his right hand and extends the left towards the barriers erected against Louisbourg in the country near which he stands. In fact, this type of portraiture of the British colonial administration and aristocracy was quite common in the 18th century, as you can see in this John Singleton Copley picture of General Thomas Gage. You can see the similarities, the way they're dressed, holding the general's truncheon, pointing to a military campaign in the background. Comparing Simbert's picture of Pepperell with Copley's portrait of Paul Revere, we can draw a clear distinction between the clothing of a royal subject of the British crown and the garments of a blacksmith who wanted to overthrow colonial rule in the 1760s. Pepperell's clothes are finely tailored and worn with great formality. Revere, on the other hand, is dressed casually, his waistcoat unbuttoned and the tools of his domestic trade before him. In another journal entry, Hawthorne took note of a gravestone with the bust of Reverend Nathaniel Rogers depicted on it. He describes it thus: on one slate gravestone of the Reverend Nathaniel Rogers, there was a portrait of that worthy, covered in relief with his cloak, band, and wig. Carved in relief with his cloak, band, and wig in excellent preservation, all of the buttons of his waistcoat being cut with great minuteness. So he's noticing this, writing it in his journal, and taking note of the clothing that's carved here. By contrast, Hawthorne described a blacksmith he observed directly. This man, in fashion similar to Revere, was dressed in, and these are Hawthorne's words, a shirt not of the cleanest, open at the breast, and the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Again, we can compare these two images or these two descriptions. Like Copley's Revere, Hawthorne's blacksmith was casually dressed in what was probably a homespun shirt, and his unbuttoned vest or waistcoat was a sartorial signifier of a certain revolutionary swagger. Moreover, Revere's shirt looks like it is linen, making it homespun. Homespun, like Revere's linen shirt, was a sign of a revolutionary attitude because it favored clothing made by and for Americans to those imported from England. So what was homespun? Homespun was basically a farm-to-wardrobe endeavor. You think of farm-to-table with food, similar in terms of clothing. Prior to the development of factory-made clothing, almost all the clothes people wore in the American colonies and the early American Republic was made at home. Families raised their own sheep or grew their own flax, prepared and then spun these fibers into thread, weaved the materials into cloth, and cut and sewed the cloth into garments. These were labor-intensive tasks that took up much of a family's time. Homespun was, until the early 19th century, the primary way Americans clothed themselves. If they did not make their own clothes, then they bartered or bought such clothes from those who did. It was only colonial administrators and aristocrats, most of whom lived in the great port cities of Boston, New York, or Philadelphia, who could bring or import their clothes from England. Wearing domestically produced clothes was an emblem of independence from the crown. Now, as early as 1722, Benjamin Franklin, at the age of 16, by the way, writing under the female pen name of Silence Dogood, admonished women for their luxurious clothing and advocated for homespun. Quote, "Pride in apparel has been growing upon us ever since we parted with our homespun clothes for 14 penny stuffs." He went on to tell women that to lessen the circumference of their hoops, women who paid no taxes and provided no public labor must avoid taking up more room in the King's Highway than the men who yearly contribute to the support of the government. Yeah. By the 1760s and 1770s, publications like the Boston Gazette encouraged Americans to make their own clothes as a way of resisting the Townsend Act and other forms of taxation and tariffs that colonial Americans felt were unfair and even tyrannical. In fact, one of the participants in the Boston Tea Party, a man by the name of William Molyneux, acquired several hundred spinning wheels and encouraged his compatriots to increase domestic yarn production. Molyneux, as we shall soon see, makes a strange cameo appearance in one of Hawthorne's first stories. Writing shortly after the Revolution, Matthew Carey, a Philadelphia publisher and friend of Alexander Hamilton, wrote the following: "We do not count it an honor to imitate the forms of government prevailing in Europe. Why should we think it honorable to imitate the fashion of their coats?" So one of Hawthorne's first published stories is called My Kinsman Major Molyneux, and was published in The Token. This is from 1832, but his story was published later, 1838 or 1840. So this image is not from his story, but as you'll see, one of the characters in the story, I think this could stand in for that figure. My Kinsman Major Molyneux deals directly with this historical period of the Revolutionary era and includes a comic satirical representation of homespun clothing. The story tells the tale of a young man named Robin who comes to the big city of Boston from the New England countryside, searching for his cousin, Major Molyneux. Although Hawthorne took this name from the historical record, his fictional Molyneux is the exact opposite of the historical William Molyneux. Hawthorne's Molyneux is a British loyalist who is tarred and feathered by the end of this story. In his quest for his cousin, young Robin interacts with various characters whose social status is evident in their clothing. For example, a young woman in, quote, scarlet petticoat and hoop skirt gives Robin a saucy eye. We kind of know what she's up to and what her status is. He also sees gay and gallant figures wearing embroidered garments of show colors, enormous periwigs, and gold-laced hats, very similar to the Pepperell and Thomas Gage portraits I just showed earlier. Robin, on the other hand, quote, was clad in a coarse gray coat, well worn, but in excellent repair. His undergarments were durably constructed of leather, and I don't think undergarments meant then what it means now, but use your imagination. His stockings of blue yarn were the incontrovertible handiwork of a mother or a sister. Okay, so clearly, Robin's clothes were homespun. If his mother or sister had made some of them, the leather would have been something you could make at home. It's not something like cotton that would have been produced. So far from seeing homespun as revolutionary, Hawthorne seems to depict it as ridiculous, a sign of innocence or of naivete or even ignorance. Hawthorne wrote this story in 1838, 1 year after a major economic crisis in the United States, and long after the War of 1812 and the textile tariffs that followed in 1816. It was also after factory production of clothing had already started in New England in the 1820s. However, in contrast to Hawthorne's satirical representation of homespun, there was a great deal of nostalgia for homespun in the 19th century. For example, in 1851, Congregationalist minister Horace Bushnell delivered a sermon marking Litchfield, Connecticut's centennial. In this secular sermon, Bushnell celebrated what he called the, quote, music of the spinning wheel and the loom, end quote, a music that he said was much more necessary than that of the harpsichord in the family home. Homespun was a sign of Republican, small r, virtue. It harkened back to Jeffersonian ideals of agrarian independence, domestic order, and even religious devotion. Similarly, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Courtship of Miles Standish, published in 1858, includes an ode to Priscilla Mullins and John Alden, ancestors of Longfellow who purportedly came to America on the Mayflower. Longfellow depicts Priscilla as at her spinning wheel, with John admiring how she, quote, layeth her hand on the spindle and holdeth the distaff, and how she clothes her family in, quote, the scarlet cloth of her weaving. He imagines her fingers spinning not just his garments, but also his household's fortunes. And finally, Lydia Sigourney, just to give you another example, was a poet whose work was almost as popular as Longfellow's. And she wrote several odes to textiles, including a popular poem titled To a Shred of Linen. This nostalgia may have been prompted by booming textile production in New England and how that production was replacing homespun by the 1830s. In 1810, Francis Cabot Lowell had established the Boston Manufacturing Company in Waltham, Massachusetts. With machine loom designs he had stolen from English factories, Lowell became one of the leaders of the American Industrial Revolution. After his death in 1817, Lowell's successors built a larger textile mill on the Merrimack River. They also erected housing and even a church to establish one of the first manufacturing towns in the United States, naming it after Lowell, Massachusetts. The manufacturers then hired young women from the New England countryside as wage laborers. In part, this was simply a way to avoid paying higher wages to men. But because the women were from the same religious and cultural background as the owners of the mills, this would purportedly avoid the social stratification to be found in the English factories that Thoreau complained about earlier. The factory owners were themselves only a generation or two removed from these same New England farms where the girls came from, the loom operators, and they were in their teens. In the 1840s, a group of the Lowell women organized to improve their working conditions, and as part of that effort, published a magazine called The Lowell Offering. This is the cover of one of them and an illustration from another. They published stories, fiction and nonfiction, about the experience of working and boarding at the mill town at Lowell. In addition to this agitation and activism on the part of female factory workers at Lowell, other activists railed against how these New England factories were implicated in the slave economy of the South. In 1848, the abolitionist and future Senator Charles Sumner argued in a fiery speech delivered in Worcester, Massachusetts, that there was an, quote, unholy union between the cotton planters and fleshmongers of Louisiana and Mississippi, and the cotton spinners and traffickers of New England, between the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. Thus, by the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, when Hawthorne published his stories and major novels, clothing production and consumption were deeply political. Many saw the emergence of factory-made clothes as exploitative. Others wanted to reclaim the simplicity and even patriotic ideals embodied in homespun. In this context, Hawthorne found the sentimentality and nostalgia of many of his contemporaries to be comical. He satirizes some of his fellow intellectuals for not living up to their ideals. Nowhere is this more evident than in one of his later novels, The Blithedale Romance. Hawthorne based the Blithedale Romance on his experience at Brook Farm, a socialist utopian experiment founded by Unitarian minister George Ripley, pictured here on the far right, in the 1840s at Roxbury, Massachusetts. Ripley and his transcendentalist comrades wanted to establish gender equality. They wanted to balance physical labor with intellectual labor. I mean, to say gender equality by their standards, I think we can kind of put that in context. To own property in common and to live off the land, including making their own clothes. Participants included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, Hawthorne's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Peabody, and Hawthorne himself. Hawthorne joined the group for only 6 months in 1841, hoping to make a home where he and Sophia could get on with their married life together. It didn't work. He ended up leaving. He left Brook Farm, not Sophia, realizing that he was not cut out for the manual labor required, and that Ripley and others were not living up to their original ideals. Blithedale, the Blithedale Romance, is Hawthorne's revenge, even though he denied any direct imitation of life at Brook Farm. Told in the first person from the point of view of Miles Coverdale, a poet similar to Hawthorne himself, the novel tells the story of 4 key characters: Zenobia, an exotic feminist modeled after Margaret Fuller; Priscilla, a poor seamstress who is exploited by so-called reformers; Hollingsworth, one of those reformers who does not live up to his own stated ideals; and Professor Westervelt, who exploits Priscilla for his own gain. One of the funniest scenes in this novel is when some of the Blithedale men realize that they have to replace their urban outfits with homespun duds. One of the things we often forget about Hawthorne, because he's so sort of dark and gothic, is that he also had a sense of humor. So hopefully this lives up to that. He writes, "We, the Blithedale men, seemed to have come to Blithedale with the one thrifty and laudable idea of wearing out our old clothes. In short, we were a living epitome of defunct fashions. We were miserably out at the elbows and most clumsily patched in the rear. The first energetic movement essential to one downright stroke of labor was sure to put a finish to these poor habiliments. So we gradually flung them all aside and took to honest homespun and linsey-woolsey, as preferable on the whole to the plan recommended, I think by Virgil, ara nudus sere nudus, in other words, running around naked." Hawthorne saw the reformers around him as well-meaning but ineffectual in their attempt to overthrow a system based on exploitation and slavery. It is not simply that they fail as manual laborers and have to wear uncomfortably coarse clothes made of wool and linen. More importantly, at least in the character of Hollingsworth and Westervelt, the so-called reformers are just as exploitative as the society they hope to transform, and their victims are often women, in particular Zenobia and Priscilla. Whoops. Actually, that is correct, and I'll go back to the other one in a minute. Interestingly, Priscilla is a seamstress. In fact, seamstresses were a popular subject of literary and political discourse between the 1830s and 1850s. For example, Catherine Beecher, the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, published a story titled simply The Seamstress in Godey's Lady's Book in 1848. These are a couple of illustrations from that publication. Godey's Lady's Book was a women's fashion magazine. Alongside patterns and designs for dressmaking, the magazine included fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. Hawthorne and many of his contemporaries were published in its pages. The Seamstress told the story of a widow who must earn her living entirely on her labors with the needle. The underlying message of the story was that women in such compromised circumstances were susceptible to abuse, moral corruption, and material exploitation by unscrupulous men. The target of Beecher's attack was not the exploitative system of wage labor that subjugated women and men, but the unscrupulous men who took advantage of the women. It was easier to condemn an individual sinner than to indict an entire society. Many other poets and writers of the time also wrote about how seamstresses were either victims or threats. This was also at a time, in fact, when both male tailors and female seamstresses were beginning to organize. Tailors moved from craft guilds to true labor unions, and some even advocated for their seamstress sisters. At least 4 important characters in Hawthorne's works are seamstresses. First, the unnamed dressmaker in the early tale, Lady Eleanor's Mantle, 1838. Hester Prynne, of course, the complex heroine of the Scarlet Letter, 1850. Priscilla, who I just mentioned in the Blithedale Romance, 1852. And Miriam, the artist and mysterious heroine of the Marble Faun, 1860. I don't have time to talk about all of these. I think you'll be glad of that. I'm not going to go on. I don't have to, but I will focus on the Scarlet Letter, a piece of fiction I'm sure at least some of you are familiar with. And I'll talk about how Hester as seamstress is an important figure, not only in Hawthorne's work, but historically at the time. Hawthorne wrote the Scarlet Letter in 1850, shortly after he had been ousted from his surveyor job in Salem. The job had been mind-numbing and resulted in writer's block, but he needed it financially. His ouster from the position was publicly humiliating. He was even accused of cronyism, and at about this same time, his mother died. In this deeply challenging period of his life, he delved into the dark story of a Puritan woman condemned for the crime of adultery. But out of that darkness, he produced a story that saw art as a path to both individual and societal redemption. First, Hawthorne clearly describes Hester's needlework as an art form. Hester, quote, possessed an art that sufficed to supply food for her thriving infant and herself. It was the art, then as now, almost the only one within a woman's grasp, that of needlework, end quote. Her needlework was a form of feminine self-expression. He writes, women derive a pleasure incomprehensible to the other sex from the delicate toil of the needle. And he goes on to say that Hester Prynne, for Hester Prynne, it might have been a mode of expressing and therefore soothing the passion of her life. I would argue that what Hawthorne says about Hester's delicate toil with her needle might also be said about Hawthorne's own delicate toil with his pen. Her medium was textiles, his medium was text. Hawthorne's writing, we might argue, was a way for him to express and therefore soothe his own passions, his anger at a political system that had dispossessed him and shamed him, his grief over his mother. Beyond what her needlework meant for herself, Hester's sewing, embroidery, and dressmaking shaped much of the appearance and identity of her community. Garments, vestments, attire, all of these can be seen not only as the outer layer of society, but as part of how it is structured, how identities are shaped, and how different people fit into different roles. For Hawthorne, Hester fashioned her community in the deepest possible sense of that word. Here's what he wrote in that novel. Her handiwork became what would be termed the fashion. Vanity chose to mortify itself by putting on for ceremonials of pomp and state the garments that had been wrought by her sinful hands. Her needlework was seen on the ruff of the governor. Military men wore it on their scarves, and the minister on his band. It decked the baby's little cap. It was shut up to be mildewed and molder away in the coffins of the dead. But her skill was never called in aid to embroider the white veil which was to cover the pure blushes of the bride. The exception indicated the ever-relentless vigor with which society frowned on her sin. Long quote, but I think worth it. So by costuming the governor in his ruff, soldiers in their scarves, the minister in his band, even the baby in a cap, Hester shapes the society that has shamed and isolated her. The exception, the bridal veil, proves the rule. Boston society forbade the adulteress from fashioning wedding dresses, but they relied on her for every other piece of clothing that they wore. By the end of the novel, Hester becomes a kind of religious leader in her own right. I agree with those critics and historians who see Hester as an homage to Margaret Fuller, whose feminist writings were embraced not only by the women she influenced through her conversation circles, including Hawthorne's wife Sophia, his sisters, and his sister-in-law, but also men like Emerson, Thoreau, and even Edgar Allan Poe, who spoke highly of her work. Here is one of the most striking descriptions of Hester's newfound social influence on her community. Again, another long quote, but bear with me. People sought her counsel as one who had herself gone through a mighty trouble. Women, especially, in the continually recurring trials of wounded, wasted, wronged, misplaced, or erring in sinful passion, came to Hester's cottage demanding why they were so wretched and what the remedy. Hester comforted and counseled them. She assured them that when the world should have grown ripe for it, a new truth would be revealed in order to establish the whole relation between men and women on a new ground of mutual happiness. The angel and apostle of the revelation must be a woman. Lofty, pure, and beautiful and wise, not through dusky grief, but the ethereal medium of joy. Right? Written in 1850, this is one of the most powerful descriptions of a strong female character who becomes a beacon of hope and comfort for her neighbors and comrades. Her society's condemnation of her sexuality is an indictment of their hypocrisy. Taken in her historical context, Hester was a revolutionary fictional character. The image of the seamstress by then had become either a sentimental image or a threatening one. Hawthorne took that image to an entirely different level by showing how this seamstress contributed to shaping, literally and figuratively, the very fabric of her society. It is clear then that Hawthorne was obsessed with New England's Puritan history. This is evident obviously in the Scarlet Letter, but also in the House of the Seven Gables, which he wrote just a year later. The House of the Seven Gables showed how the Puritan past was not past at all. It continued to haunt the present. The novel is a Gothic story about a disputed piece of property and the cursed and rotting old house that sits on it. It is the story of a multi-generational feud between, spanning 200 years from the 1600s to the 1800s between the Pynchon and the Mall families. The Pynchons were a rich and powerful family who stole the property in question. The Malls were a plebeian clan rumored to be wizards and witches. The narrative moves back and forth between the Puritan era when Matthew Mall put a curse on old Colonel Pynchon saying, "God will give him blood to drink," and the 1840s, when we find the remaining Pynchons divided between a wealthy and powerful branch and an impoverished line who nonetheless retain ownership of the House of the Seven Gables. Jaffrey Pynchon is a powerful judge and would-be governor. Hepzibah Pynchon is a penniless aristocrat, gentility in rags, as Hawthorne describes her, who has been forced to open a penny shop in one of the wings of the House of the Seven Gables to make ends meet. Clifford Pynchon is a sensitive and artistic soul who has spent 30 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. And Phoebe Pynchon is a gentle and innocent country cousin who brings light and life to Clifford and Hepzibah's dark isolation. On the Mall side, we have Holgrave. We never get his first name, a modern descendant of the wizard and carpenter of old. Finally, there is a minor character, Uncle Venner, who takes on a major thematic role, as I will discuss in a minute. Hawthorne is not just telling a story here. He is also serving as the tailor for many of his characters. For Jaffrey, Clifford, Holgrave, and Uncle Venner. If we compare how each of these characters is clothed, we get a sense of what Hawthorne felt about the changes occurring around him in the 1840s. The most direct, oh no, now I've given away the whole punchline. Oh well. The most direct descendant and inheritor of Colonel Pynchon's power and wealth, as well as his greed, duplicity, and cruelty, is Jaffrey Pynchon, who wants to buy the House of the Seven Gables from his cousin and to expropriate the large stretch of land that was stolen twice, once from the American Indians and then from the Malls. Hawthorne's description of Jaffrey relies on clothing to demonstrate his similarity to the Pynchon of old, Colonel Pynchon, who died with blood on his ruff and blood on his hands. In the novel, it is as if that old Pynchon has time traveled from the 17th century to the modern world of the 1840s. The Puritan garments hang on Jaffrey like the aura of a ghost. The old clothes seem to evaporate to be replaced by ready-made attire. Here we have a portrait I'm going to talk about in a minute that Hawthorne described again in one of his journals. And of course, on the right, we have Nathaniel himself. I only use this because the suit he's wearing is probably similar to what I'm going to describe here. On his arrival from the other world, he had merely found it necessary to spend a quarter of an hour at a barber's who had trimmed down his Puritan's full beard into a pair of grizzled whiskers. Then, patronizing a ready-made clothing establishment, I'm just going to underline ready-made and can file that away, he had exchanged his velvet doublet and sable cloak on the left for a white collar and cravat, coat, vest, and pantaloons. The Colonel Pynchon of 2 centuries ago stepped forward as the Jaffrey Pynchon of the passing moment. Hawthorne's source for this portrait of the old Pynchon comes from a painting of Governor John Leverett, which you see here. He also saw this in that same Essex Historical Society that I referred to before. And here's how he describes this I believe it's an engraving. Governor Leverett, a dark mustachioid face, the figure 2/3 length, clothed in a sort of frock coat, buttoned and a broad sword belt girded round the waist and fastened with a large steel buckle. The hilt of the sword, steel, altogether very striking. This description is very similar to Hawthorne's description of the portrait of Colonel Pynchon described elsewhere in the novel. In the same journal entry, he goes on to pass moral judgment on what those clothes and old paintings say about the Puritan past. Quote, "Nothing gives a stronger idea of old worm-eaten aristocracy, of a family being crazy with age, and of its being time that it be extinct, than these black, dusty, faded, antique-dressed portraits," end quote. In contrast to the old clothes of the Puritan ancestor, Geoffrey Pynchon acquired his clothing from a ready-made clothing establishment. What was ready-made clothing in the 19th century? Even before the 19th century, there were businesses known as slop shops. That sold cheap clothing, much of it secondhand. Then in 1818, Henry Brooks opened a tailor shop in Manhattan, and by the 1830s, his sons, under the name Brooks Brothers, were selling ready-made suits in New York. In Boston, it was Oak Hall that provided the cheapest ready-made clothing available, starting at about the same time or shortly after in the 1840s. George Simmons was the founder and proprietor of Oak Hall, and he was not just a clothing retailer, but one of America's first advertisers. He advertised aggressively, as these magazine advertisements show. On the left there, the ad includes the following text. Standing unrivaled as the largest, cheapest, and most fashionable establishment for custom ready-made clothing, rich piece goods, and every article adapted to the wear of gentlemen of business, leisure, sportsman, or mechanic in the U.S., end quote. Note that Oak Hall purports to provide the same quality for men of all classes at the same price, from gentlemen of business to the mechanic. Right. This suggests a kind of democratization of clothing that ready-made clothing provided. In another advertising campaign, Simmons and his company went after the youth market. Simmons produced an Oak Hall pictorial or picture book that glamorized the store itself and told the story of a country boy whose father brings him to the city to buy a new suit of clothes at Oak Hall. And this whole story is really, it's actually available online, and I'm going to share a reading list with everyone after, and you can peruse this on your own. Hawthorne dresses Holgrave, the young descendant of the Mall clan, entirely in Oak Hall attire. Holgrave is a 22-year-old writer and artist. He is a daguerreotype photographer who has also worked as an editor of a political magazine. He's traveled to Europe, practiced dentistry, worked in a cologne factory, written short fiction for magazines, and now dabbles in mesmerism and hypnosis. He has also, like the Blithedalians, been part of a socialist community similar to the one Hawthorne participated in, Brook Farm. So he's kind of representative of sort of progressive thinkers of his time. Hawthorne describes Holgrave's clothing in some detail. Quote, "As for his dress, it was of the simplest kind, a summer sack of cheap and ordinary material, thin checkered pantaloons, and a straw hat, by no means of the finest braid. Oak Hall might have supplied his entire equipment. He was chiefly marked as a gentleman, if such indeed he made any claim to be, by the rather remarkable whiteness and nicety of his clean linen." Holgrave is the embodiment of the modern man. As an artist, his medium is the latest technology of photography. He wears ready-made clothes from Oak Hall, and his social and political views are equally modern. He rails against private property. He condemns multi-generational wealth. Holgrave feels that society and its institutions should be remade every 20 years or so. In making this point, he uses the metaphor of clothing. He says in this novel, "We shall live to see the day when no man shall build his house for posterity. Why should he? He might just as reasonably order a durable suit of clothes, leather or gutta percha or whatever else lasts longest, so that his great-grandchildren might have the benefit of them." He's saying that it would make as much sense to pass on your clothing to your offspring as it would to pass on a house. In this sense, he is not too different from Thoreau, with whom I began. In Walden, Thoreau discusses how young farmers were burdened rather than blessed with the inheritance of property. Did they own the farm, or did the farm own them? And Hawthorne probably had Thoreau in mind in his depiction of the ironically short-sighted viewpoint of Holgrave, the daguerreotypist. Intellectuals like Holgrave have colorful ideas in their youth, but these ideas fade quickly under the bright light of critical analysis. And once again, Hawthorne relies on a sartorial metaphor to make his point. Quote, "We meet with young men of Holgrave's age for whom we anticipate wonderful things, but of whom we never hear another word. The effervescence of youth and passion give them a false brilliancy, which makes fools of them and other people." And here's the clothing part. "Like certain chintzes, calicos, and ginghams, they show finely in their first newness, but cannot stand the sun and rain and assume a very sober aspect after washing day." Hawthorne goes on to say that Holgrave's, quote, "error lay in supposing that this age, more than any future or past one, is destined to see the tattered garments of antiquity exchanged for a new suit, instead of gradually renewing themselves by patchwork." Hawthorne believed that the best way to reform society was gradually, and this metaphor of prudent renewal through patchwork is best embodied in the character Uncle Venner. He is an old farmer, not wealthy, but self-sufficient and rich in wisdom. Ultimately, Venner's wardrobe shows how society should combine old traditions with modern innovations. And here's a quote describing Uncle Venner. "He was clad in an old blue coat, which had a fashionable air, and must have accrued to him from the cast-off wardrobe of some dashing clerk. As for his trousers, they were of tow cloth, very short in the legs, and bagging down strangely in the rear, but yet having a suitableness to his figure which his other garment entirely lacked. His hat had relation to no other part of his dress, and but very little to the head that wore it. Thus Uncle Venner was a miscellaneous old gentleman, partly himself, but in good measure somebody else. Patched together, too, by different epochs, an epitome of times and fashions." Hawthorne feared that radical activists of his time, like Thoreau or Margaret Fuller, Harriet Beecher Stowe, George Ripley, even his friends Ralph Waldo Emerson and Herman Melville, were like Holgrave. At a time when new clothes and new ideas could be bought cheap, they wanted to throw out the past like tattered old homespun garments. But Hawthorne advocated for a society that was more like Uncle Venner, an epitome of times and fashions, a patchwork of different ideas from different epochs, not a wholesale replacement of the old with the new. Thank you.